Thank you, all of you, first of all, for coming here. To start with, Shri Sudhir Kulkarni ji, my friend Mridul Nide, if I pronounce correctly in Marathi, my young friend, which I met today, Apurva Valse Patil. She is very hardworking, very eager, and I think Bombay, Mumbai has a future in foreign policy when it comes to seeing people like Apurva. My thanks are also due to Nehru Center, YCC, Supriya Sureji, who couldn't make it today, and above all, which I call the last icon of Nehruvian and Gandhian principle, Shri Sharad Pawar ji. My regards to him. And all the members of YCC, especially Deepthi, and all others who have made this program event an ongoing event. Now, to start with, everybody's talking about Mumbai dialogues. Why is Mumbai important? In the 50s or 40s, late 40s, there was a Bombay group of industrialists which came up, which proposed how India's, industrial policy should be shaped. Now, if I remember correctly, that Bombay group was few leading industrialists of those times. Foreign policy has always been a niche affair. From times immemorial, we have seen that it's only the elite which circulate among the foreign policy shenanigans, right? Now, if you try to understand why is foreign policy a niche affair, because it's always elite-run affair. People who run are not actually grounded. They are elite, move in elite circles. And if you take the example of our diplomatic services, they are also elite who hardly interact. That's why a decade back, Public Diplomacy Division came up in the Ministry of External Affairs, which is doing a fairly good job in involving people and initiating a dialogue. I would imagine a similar Bombay group coming up on world affairs from Mumbai. And why I am saying this, I have a reason behind this. Being in North India, being in Delhi for the past 35, 40 years, which is my adopted city, and I call Mumbai my soul city, we have seen the aggression which is seen due to the power hierarchy relationship that exists in Mumbai. Delhi. What happens even if you confront someone while driving a car or coming out, people come out very aggressively, which is unlike Mumbai, which is more cooperative, more open-minded, and above all accommodating of all the diversities. Foreign policy of our country should be like that. It should accommodate rather than distinguish. It should be accommodative. And I always say, why has not there been feminization of international relations of foreign policy? Sweden, for example, and all the Nordic countries and the Benelux countries have incorporated feminization of international relations, and a very dominant theme in international relations theory is what we call as feminist international relations theory, in which cooperation and accommodation rather than conflict is given importance. Mumbai, again, can come with that idea of accommodation, that idea of development. Mumbai is more business-like, unlike Delhi, which I said. So let this idea emanate, and I have prepared a voluminous paper, which we do for academic circles, but I will occasionally refer to it. Let me at the outset make it very clear that Russia is an aggressor. I say this while I teach Russia. I have sympathy for Russians. I have been there n number of times. I have been to Ukraine, to Poland. Russia has violated the international principle of the sovereignty, of transgression of boundaries, And the Nehruvian idea of accommodation, again, the Panchsheel values, all those ideas which India stood for all these years, or has stood for all these years, has been violated in the Russian aggression. It was unprovoked, it was blatantly unfair to intervene in a foreign country. It is going on in a very unfair way. But having said this, let me tell it to you that the present lecture is based on the realist philosophy of international relations. Realist philosophy actually talks about powers, national interests, centrality of the state. I might sound sympathetic or anti-Russia, but this is an academic exercise, and those who do not agree with me are, most welcome to ask questions, clarifications on it. Now, Ukraine actually means frontier in Russian language. So, Ukraine has been the frontier of Russia since time immemorial. There has been history of Ukraine becoming part of Russia now and then, and the Ukraine that we see today is not Ukraine that has existed from times immemorial. Ukraine was divided into two halves many a time. The Ukraine, the other part of the Dnipro River, the western Ukraine, Dnipro River is the river which bisects Ukraine into two halves. The eastern half is more Russian, there are more Russian speakers. There has been overflowing population which has been moving in and out. Putin is very fond of saying that, look, Ukraine was never a country. It was made into a country by the Soviets in the 1920s, which is blatantly unfair and wrong. Putin quotes, again, that it was the Kievan Rus that was in 800 AD that the Russians traced their history from. Kievan Rus was actually a movement of people from Ukraine to Russia, which they dominate, and their capital or their base was Kiev. They adopted Christianity, Greek Orthodox Christianity, and that adoption of Greek Orthodox Christianity actually mainstreamed Russia or the Rus into European security and political architecture. When Edward Said wrote his Orientalism, he actually had written about or made a distinction between Orientalism and Occidentalism. The Edward Said idea was that the Occident has been fashioned on what Orient is not. Similarly, Russia has been fashioned or been tried to fashion what Europe has not been. Or for both the Russians and Europeans, they are the other. For Russians, it's the European which are the others. For Europeans, it's the for Europeans, it's the Russians which are the others, and for the Russians, it's the Europeans which are the others. So this otherization process has gone on for centuries. We have numerous rulers, numerous kings, queens who have come to rule Russia or that land, who have always looked towards West. Ukraine, Kievan Rus, from which the modern origin of Russians, I said, started, adopted Christianity in 988. The ruler who adopted Yaroslav actually wanted, and he went shopping for religions, whether they should follow Islam. Again, they discarded Islam because of the Mongol invasion and the brutality that they had. They discarded Jews because they said, their religion is too austere. There is no pomp and show when it comes to celebration. So Russians are hard drinkers, they drink vodka and they celebrate vodka. This is not allowed in Catholicism nor in Jew religion, Zionism. They adopted Greek Orthodox Church variant of religion. Now, there's also a history. I mean, the ruler of Kievan Rus wanted to marry the queen or queen's daughter, who was ruler then. He actually sent proposal which was rejected, and since he was a very strong ruler, he threatened that he'll take over Kiev and give that to other Catholic rulers or Catholic Christians and come to rule over Kiev. That deterred a bit the Greek Orthodox Church, and they started proselytizing in Russia. That's how Orthodox religion came into Russia. Now, before that, they were enemies. They were, worshippers of nature. There were many religions or many ways of worshipping God. Now, so they have a common origin. They are the same people. But what went wrong all these years? To cut the story short, after Yaroslav, there was another ruler who came into being. His name was Volodymyr. Now, all of you know who is Volodymyr. He's Volodymyr Zelensky's namesake. He actually established the Kievan Rus further towards what is modern day St. Petersburg and Moscow. And gradually, for 200 years, they were the rulers, and they moved into Russia and they start ruling there. Moscow became the center, and that's how religion came into being. That's how they were accepted by the Europeans. But for 300 long years, they were under the Mongol invasion, who ruled over them, who brutalized them, who finished their all industry, farming, everything that they had. After 1500 AD, the modern dynasties came into being, what we know as the Romanov dynasty, which ruled till 1917, the Russian Revolution. Now, all of them idealized West. For example, Catherine the Great, Ekaterina as she called in Russian, was actually a German princess of a small state. She started ruling over Russia, and she expanded the entire Russian territory that we see today. It didn't exist in the past. Now, the exact idea of Kievan Rus being there originated moved from Kiev to Moscow. That's how their concept of history also moved. Now, since 1917, and there was a brief period from 1917 to 1921, that was when there was a power vacuum, when Russia withdrew from the First World War and the communists came into power, Bolsheviks came into power. They actually were not being able to, for those 4 years, they were not able to control the territory. They had self-government then, not only Ukraine, but the South Caucasian states, for example, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, they also had some semblance of democracy, but the only thing that they lacked was the people who could govern them. It was democracy, but run by elites. The movement of people from Russia to the rest of Central Asia actually started after Tsarist rule. What we see today as Ukraine is actually legacy of the past. When Russians, when they moved to present-day Moscow, started controlling that part of Ukraine and started believing that this is now Ukraine or the borderland. Now Moscow is at the center. The identity that has developed of Ukrainians can actually be the modern identity, the modern constitutional democratic identity can be traced from 1917. That was how Ukrainian as an identity evolved. All of us know what happened after the 1990s when Soviet Union fell apart, 15 new states came into being, Ukraine was one of them. Ukraine, Belarus and Russia were the three states which were never thought to be warring with each other. Especially Ukraine, because Ukraine was like the cultural heritage of all the Russians. They, as I told you, they trace their origins from there. Now,
after 1990s, all of them were looking for, after the fall of socialism, all of them were looking for the ways to bring people together. How would they consolidate people together? How would they bring them together? That time, nationalism became a big issue or a big rallying point for democratic states to mobilize people under one roof. In the 90s, as you see, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, came out of Soviet fold, post-Soviet state, and said that we have nothing to do with Russian state, the modern Russian state, and we do not even want to be part in any way with their present or past history. So they moved out. That's when all of these states, and there is a concept in Russian which calls Blizhny Zerubezhe, which means near abroad. Now Russia thinks it's moral right or political right to control over the near abroad. And which are near abroad? All the 15 post-Soviet states. And it was kind of a Monroe Doctrine which the Americans had followed for the entire 20th century, that where they would not allow others to interfere in the Americas, that's North and South America. It was sort of a Monroe Doctrine that they did not think they would allow anyone in the former Soviet space, especially those 14 remaining or 11 remaining states, and 12 including Russia, that no state or no power could interfere. 90s was the period or the decade when Russia had lots of problems, when Russian economy was in shambles. We had people, who were queuing for bread. There was no bread because all of the grain was produced in Ukraine. All the bread factories, or grain processing factories were in Russia. The borders came up, customs duty came up. There were lots of problems. But in the 90s, a new problem came. When the borders came and the identities evolved, the next step started. How to consolidate the national rule. How to make borders secure. Now, in the 90s, there was a move, and Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia actually applied for NATO's membership, and they got. Ukraine didn't apply. There were other states who were looking to apply. For example, Georgia was one of the state which started talking about taking the membership of NATO. What did Russia do? In 2008, it invaded Georgia, and in 5 days it defeated. Georgia is a small state, more of a landlocked because the only opening it has is in the Black Sea. Russians divided Georgia into 3 states. That's present Georgia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia. No state other than Russia recognizes them as states. Similar moves were made in Moldova, where there was Transnistria, where Russians had. And Russians also said that, look, we have our people who speak the same language. Who should be there? And they have been there. For example, in Kazakhstan, the population of Russia in 1991 was 28, Russians was around 28%. And the Kazakhstanis were around 35%. Slowly, the out-migration and in-migration happened. The population of Russians increased in Kazakhstan, and the Kazakhstanis increased because they started moving back to Kazakhstan, because Kazakhstan, again, after Russia, is the most prosperous country. Similar movements were also happening in other parts of the former Soviet Union. Ukrainians and Belarusians, for example, never considered themselves as not being Russians. Just that an identity had evolved. They had a different variant of language which they spoke. Belarus, all of us even today know that it's strongly behind Russia. Now, Russia throughout its 90s, if you read the paper which I have circulated, was always looking for a NATO membership. This NATO membership was not forthcoming. It was assured by Clinton and later Bush that it would be made member of NATO and it would be part of the Western security architecture. But it was never made. That aspiration of Russia becoming member of NATO was also, didn't find a place in the sun of the Western security architecture. That was the first fault that the Westerners did against Russia. I mean, there have been numerous quotes which I have given, which says that actually Russia in principle agreed to include Russia in NATO, but that never happened. And that left Russians from the high table of the Western security architecture. They were given the capitalist way of development. They were allowed to, I mean, the investments were allowed in Russia, but they were not actually making them like the Westerners. So the otherization process of 90s was also very difficult, or it actually exacerbated the latent tendencies of Russian and the Russian elite to make Europe or the West also as the other. Now, Putin today always says, why is NATO required? Who does NATO cater to? Right? He's perfectly wrong. Warsaw's Pact has been disbanded. Comecon, which was, European community, which later became European Union counterpart in the socialist bloc, that has dissolved. What is the use of NATO? Russians started believing that it's the NATO which has otherized Russia. Who is the enemy of NATO? It's not the West Asians, it's not the Africans, it's not the Asians. It is the Russians which they have, pointed out, or for which they have created. And all the new, post-Soviet states of the Iron Curtain, behind the Iron Curtain, became members of NATO. Moldova, for example, which was a former Soviet state, perhaps the poorest country in Europe, was never given membership of NATO, never even called for being associated with NATO in 1990s during the Partnership for Peace program, for which even Russia was made member. Russia's misunderstanding with the West is also not misplaced. Whenever we hear of Russian aggression, Russian power, Russian authority, we forget that what was Russia looking for? It was looking for its place in the sun, in the Western sun, for example, which was not given. Russia cannot be faulted on that count. The second point, till the 90s, it was a very delicate situation that was there, when Yeltsin was the president. The economy of Russia was in shambles, as I told. In 2000, when Putin came into power, Putin actually transformed Russian economy. And it was not Putin exactly, it was the oil prices which, transformed Russian economy. I always call Russia as democratic Saudi Arabia, right? Because it's actually Gazprom which rules Russia, Gazprom and Lukoil and all the oil companies, just as probably Aramco rules Saudi Arabia, the oil marketing company. Now, Russia started developing itself as an energy superpower. The Ukraine crisis that we see today is not a result of an overnight crisis. No. There was a festering sore against Ukraine's move to become part of the West from 2000 onwards. 1997, Leonid Kuchma, the president, was removed. He was replaced by a new ruler. In matter of 18 months, from 2003 to 2004, there were three what Russians call, or what we know as, the colored revolutions. In Kyrgyzstan, the tulip revolution; in Ukraine, the orange revolution; and in Georgia, the rose revolution, which replaced the rulers there. And that sort of colored revolution Russia was expecting against Putin also when it started after Putin was re-elected as a president. For 4 years he was the prime minister. When he was re-elected as president, similar demonstrations started happening in Moscow or in other major Russian cities. And it has been well documented that all these three revolutions were aided by the so-called Western NGOs. The so-called, spreaders of democracy, if there is any term, who actually instigated the local population who already had grievances. It's not that they did not had grievances, but it was not a grievance that went against Russian interests. The Westerners say that, look, the tulip revolution which happened in Kyrgyzstan, which replaced Aksar Akayev as the ruler with a different ruler, actually did not make it pro-West or pro-NATO. It remained within the Russian fold. And they always give example of Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, who was ruler of Kazakhstan till 2019, from 1991, for all these years. He actually nurtured relations with Russia in a very meaningful way. He was very accommodative of the interests of Russia because, Kazakhstan shares a very long borders with Russia, and all the northern part of Kazakhstan, if you see, is populated by the Russians, right? So again, Putin has said in the past, in very recent past, that even Kazakhstan's borders are artificial. I mean, how long this will go on, I don't know, but Putin has said this. And it's not actually borders. If you see the borders of Russia and Kazakhstan, for instance, you will see straight lines. Just as somebody sitting on the cartographic table has drawn a line, box, and said that this is the border, because they do not have natural boundaries. There have been fencing which is going on, but that's not sufficient. I mean, there are smugglers, there are arms traders who actually go in and out of these border areas. So, borders were not permanent. And what incensed Russians was also that, look, despite having all the material resources, all the natural resources which we see in the Mendeleev's table is there in Russia. You name it. Russia is not Angola or Syria, where you sanction it and the economy goes bonkers. No, it won't happen. Russia is a very big economy. We must realize that. Russians do not have, Russia is a very unique state. Again, coming back to Russia. Russians do not have to crave for housing because Soviets gave them housing. Their population is decreasing, so the demand for housing is not there. The taxes, the highest taxes that they pay is only 15%. And we pay around 30%, the highest taxes that they have. Service taxes are around 28%, and if you add excise, we end up paying around 50% taxes for a car, for example, for which they pay only 10%. Now, they have lot of spending capacity. Russia, and when I say Russia, I mean both Ukraine and Belarus, has the highest working women population in the world. Around 75% of the Russian women actually go out to work and add to the productive capability of the state. All this has happened, and Russians, including Ukrainians and Belarusians, are always, get very sentimental. If you want to befriend a Russian or an Ukrainian, just tell them that I sympathize with you on what happened with the Second World War. All the former Soviet space in the Eastern Europe, all of them, each family lost at least one male able-bodied family member. Imagine father, brother, son. And women had to step out to work, and that has still gone on. What did Putin do in this Ukrainian crisis? He actually incensed people that these are the same people, the Nazi, the right-wingers, the Azov army, which had, taken occupation of the Azovstal steel plant, if you remember, in Mariupol a couple of months back, and which was taken over by Russia. These are the same people, the same, they use the swastika as insignia. So the Russians were evoked incensed wrongly by Putin. It was not the right wing or the Nazi forces, they were actually also fighting the Nazi forces during the Second World War. They were also fighting the Germans. In Ukraine, at least 1 million Jews were killed by Hitler's army. 50 million Ukrainians were killed by the, 5 million Ukrainians were actually killed by the Hitler's army, by the fascist forces. Now, so that evoked passion, that was misplaced. So in 2000 to 2008, I would, if you say, was a golden period of Russian economy where it evolved, it stabilized from a deficit economy. Now they had 600 billion US dollars as foreign reserves. Their GDP actually grew threefold. So Putin became a hero. And it was not Putin, I mean, who actually saw that oil prices rose. It was the market forces which helped Putin to come into power and be Putin what he is today. The 2008 Georgian war actually was the first start of the Russian ascendancy as economic and a regional superpower. 2008, when Georgia lost its war, it started evoking passions in the West also, that it might happen with other states also. I mean, what happened in 2013-14 in Ukraine was actually, the pro-Western leaders in Ukraine which disrupted the cordial relations, which I would say, between the Ukrainian speakers and the Russian speakers. Even today, Ukraine has around, if not less than 30% Russian speakers. Most of the eastern Ukraine, I would tell you, especially the cities, are dominated by Russian speakers. They have sympathy for Russia, but they are Ukrainians, mind you. They would not want their country to be broken by Russians. Just as they speak Russian, they are, the followers of Orthodox Church, doesn't mean that they are Russians. They are Russian speakers. But this has been propagated by Putin and his men, that these are actually Russians, they sympathize with you. So, from 2008 to 2014 was the period when Putin's popularity graph rose in Russia. At one point in time, around 2010 or 11, Putin's popularity rating was 95%. And this is done by a Levada Center, which is a very independent polling, opinion poll maker. Now it's somewhere around 65%. Even today, I mean, what all is going on there, today it's 65. I always ask Russians, or the Central Asians, or the East Europeans, that why do you have such voting tendencies? Why do you vote 97% for or 98% for or 98% against? They say that, look, we are not like India, where you have 30% people voting for a gentleman becoming prime minister and saying that I am what I am India, or I would be India. This is not what Russia is. If we have 30% majority ruling over us, there will be 15 Russia within Russia itself, meaning that they will be divided because they won't tolerate someone who's not popular. And by default, the template which Putin has set, by extinguishing opposition, by extinguishing popular press, by extinguishing all the mediums of free expression of speech and curbing them. And this template has been followed in Turkey, which is again a democratic country. And I'm afraid this template is being followed again in our country also. Right? For all the reasons that these men have established, and they are projected as the leaders. But coming to the main point, what we have also seen that after 2014, what happened was that there was, and 2014 all of us know that the Crimean dispute happened. Crimea was taken over by Ukraine, from Ukraine by Russia. not by force, but it was actually by force where, the Russian soldiers, regulars, walked into Crimea in irregular uniforms without any insignia or badge or cap or beret. And they actually took over the entire Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, which had 75% Russian population then. And a phony referendum was done, in which actually 93% of Crimeans voted for integration with Russia, and that Crimean reintegration, quote unquote, with Russia is still not accepted by the world, not even by China. Leave alone India. India has always been silent, but we do accept Crimea to be part of Russia for various reasons. I mean, not related to Russia's domination. So this was a brief history. I would not go into the actual details of the war because it's still unfolding, and we are seeing every day on television channels that, especially in Hindi channels, if you see, वो कहते हैं अब तीसरा विश्व युद्ध होने वाला है. I mean, every day they would say that अब तो हो ही गया, अब तो चल ही रहा है. And this has also been picked by, channels like Al Jazeera and CNN. One day I saw when the G20 meeting was happening in Indonesia, in Bali, that unfortunate incident of a missile landing up in Polish territory happened. Even CNN said that, and Volodymyr Zelensky, the television personality, that he appreciates himself to be seen on television in those camouflage dresses, which you always see him wearing. He's actually, if I am asked publicly or privately, whom do you blame for war in Russia? I would blame Volodymyr Zelensky equally with Putin. Why? Because this man, I have no qualms saying this. This man actually led Ukraine to a war with Russia, provoked by the Westerners who were ready to sell their arms, their HIMARS, their NASMARs, their Patriot missiles, their howitzers, and all sorts of weapons. They are being tested. All the old, unused missiles which were reaching their expiry date by Russians are now being tested in Ukraine. All the Americans are selling their outdated missiles, selling them to Ukrainians, and they are happily buying it. They never know that this is not an never-ending phenomena. ये अनंत काल तक नहीं चलेगा. It has to stop somewhere. No? And when it stops, and seeing the nature of the war that is happening, the economy that is not only of Ukraine or Russia, but the Western economy. You have Britain, which has 10% inflation, which has USA, which has 8% inflation. And Biden today, I saw in one of the news, was saying that the Americans must thank the administration because they have brought the gas prices, petrol prices down. They must thank Indians also because they have started buying oil from Russia. Had they not been buying oil and had they imposed, the sanctions Indians would have carried forward, the oil prices would have gone up, right? What Americans have done, they have banned Iranian oils, Indians can't buy. They have banned Venezuelan oil, they have sanctions against them. They have actually trying to persuade India and China and many other countries to stop buying oils from them, right? And rightfully, and I think it's a right decision also to be made, that we cannot handle our economy with such oil prices. We are a very delicate economy, and we have, weathered many storms. Now, coming back to the next part of the discussion, reshaping of the world order. Now, for 30 years from 1991, when the Cold War ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, we have reaped the dividends of peace. There was only one superpower, all of us know. America, which actually tried to impose its universal architecture of security and economy to the world. And now that has stabilized. Russia also looks forward to have an economy which would match Russian economy, American economy, which would actually mirror American economy, and they also want to be like any Western states. But that has been prohibited by the West. How would the new world order reshape? The new world order that's now going to evolve would be completely different from what there was for the past 30 years, which I said was the dividend of peace. Now, how do you see world reacting to Russia's downfall? I would say that Russia's downfall has now started. Russia would not be the same power as it was prior to this war, at least perceived sense. You know, why have Russians failed in Ukraine? They are seen as a world power because they were never prepared for a infantry or artillery kind of war. They had all the ICBMs, IRBMs to target Paris, Berlin, and London, and even New York. But they did not have the capability to defend their borders and encroach upon others' borders. Right? So, despite all the failures that Russia has had, one of the biggest miscalculation that Putin has done is to actually fight a war with Ukraine, in which, and all of us know what happened to Britain after Second World War. Britain was as ruined as probably Germany. But the only benefit that Britain had, that it had a benefactor in USA. And later Germany also got a benefactor in USA. And how they imposed upon the constitution making of, nobody complains today that why Germany has a pacifist constitution. It was imposed on Germany. Why Japan says that it is not an offensive power? Because its security is guaranteed by USA. Its constitution has been written by General MacArthur, who wrote it in their constitution that you will not step outside, the Japanese military would not step outside their territory for offensive purposes. So they are rather self-defense forces. 35,000 US soldiers are stationed in Hokkaido. The world that we are now witnessing, we are seeing, would be a world in which China would replace Russia as a major power. Now, the security architecture of the world would shift from Europe, from West Asia, and now West Asia is also now gradually coming to terms with Israel as being their neighbor, with Abraham Accords that have come in. It's only 2 states, well, probably 3 states, which are still opposed to those Abrahamic Accords. That's Iran, Syria, and Libya. That scene would now shift to the so-called Indo-Pacific region. NATO would be relevant because Russia still retains its large firepower in the nuclear power, the nuclear substance that it has created, that it had from the past, is still there. It's not that Russia would suddenly collapse, and it's not that Putin would give up, and there are many theories which are going around that, after this, after the war settles or if the things cool down, Putin would be removed. Putin has not created a second-rung leadership like all dictators do, right? He has no son or siblings to replace him. Similarly, in what will happen, what is again a conjecture, we are still in midst of a war, that China, sometimes I wonder, why is China openly talking about Russia or voting for Russia in UN resolutions or, abstaining in favor of Russia in UN resolutions? and not actually supporting Russia in wars or in sanctions. It's only because Russia, now China sees, would be a sub-state of Chinese security architecture, because the way that it has been downgraded by the West, because its capabilities have been exposed to the West, because, and the more the war goes, Putin has realized, and I mean, those who study Russian politics realized it long back, that the long the war goes on, long it would be difficult to defend Russia. Because the armaments which Ukraine is getting is now getting more severe and more dangerous weapon that it's now getting. Ukrainian army is getting more training, more support from the West. The stockpiles of Russian arms and armaments are depleting. Their army morale is down. Their capability to fight a long and sustained war on a different front is also down. The world that would reshape itself in present terms would be entirely different from what it had been in the past. Yes, how much has, these are the questions that I had posed. How much has Russia's attack on Ukraine changed the world order? Are we on a cusp of a new era? Some will argue that everything is fundamentally altered while others disagree. West has reaffirmed its commitment to NATO, to the security architecture of NATO. West has now started facing another monster, which is the rising expenditure in defense. You know, NATO has always argued that, look, America shoulders around 75% of NATO's budget. American GDP for defense is around 3.68. Italy's GDP for defense is around 0.95%. NATO always says that it should be 2% minimum, and average should be 2% to make NATO an assertive power. Trump initially had started talking about that, America cannot take the responsibility for European security. It has to come from the Russians, from the Europeans themselves. Russia is not an enemy until you make an enemy. That's what Trump said. And for once, I do not fault Trump on this. Because it's actually the free riding which the Germans, which the Italians, which the French were doing. Right? What if Germany starts rearming itself? What if Japan claims that now things have gone above our heads, we will also rearm ourselves? LDP, Shinzo Abe, for example, had openly advocated for getting more and more weapons, getting more and more military personnel, rewriting the constitution so that Japan becomes a offensive state rather than being a defensive state. So the reshaping of the world order, in my opinion, would be in one where Russia still remains a power, though depleted in many ways, but it would not be the same Russia. Russian economy, because part of it is also sponsored by the military-industrial complex, would now not be reliable. For states like India and China and many Southeast Asian countries, which buy their weapons from Russia, now would give a rethinking. So who's the gainer at the end of the war? It's not the Ukrainians or the Russians. It has been the Americans. Their HIMARS would now sell. Now, in Putin, saying in 2019, was asked why Russia was putting all its egg in one Chinese basket. He says, we have enough eggs, but there are not many baskets where these eggs can be placed. So what world has done, what has America done, that it has put Russia closer to China, put Russia, deliberately in the Chinese orbit of security architecture. Russia would emerge as dependent on China after this war. Putin has now reversed the trend that it has been for 300 years, starting from Peter the Great, down to Putin, where they were looking towards West as their model. Now they would look towards East, and the pivot, what they call as pivot of the East, that would be their foreign policy principle. But would China allow Russia to lose? I don't think so. Because if that happens, it would also be bad for Chinese economy, right? They would not want it to happen. What if Putin is replaced? China also would not want that. Because what if post-Putin leadership that emerges, what if it becomes friends with the West? What will happen then? Right? So these are all, hypothetical argument that I am making, since it's still evolving. That's why I had, given less emphasis on the reshaping of the world order rather than the Ukrainian conflict. The world now would again be back to the 1991, not with the dividend of peace or dividend of war, but where the US would again become a dominant player that it has been for the past 100 odd years. Since 1917, after the 1918, after the end of the First World War, where actually it was US which had brought Europe or made Europe victorious through various measures, and Woodrow Wilson's 14-point principles were, a determinant factor in that change of nature of the war in favor of Europe. Now that United States would become more important. How would India react to all this? That's the major question. India has started mending its fences with US after the civil nuclear accord that we had in 2006-7, and that was the turning point of Indian foreign policy led by the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, which actually many naysayers said that it would not be good for India to turn to the West because they have not been very reliable as an ally, but they have been reliable in many ways. And India is not what India was 30, 40 or 50 years back. India has now also come on its feet. Whenever you see Western literature or Western narrative on YouTube, and all of them start bracketing China and India as backers of Russia, which we are not. Russia has always looked for, US has always looked for an enemy. It had earlier the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. Now it has found Putin as its enemy. And it's not Putin's war only. Putin is actually riding on the wave that he created. But actually Russians also are behind Putin in creating this new order which Putin has created for himself and for Russia. The world order that would develop now and henceforth would be where Asia will become a major player in world economy, especially countries like China and India and Indonesia and Malaysia, all these Southeast Asian economies. It's not that Germany and Italy and France would not be important. No, they would be important. But their main USP of not spending more on defense, not concentrating more on defense, would now be negated. Because after Finland and Sweden coming into the NATO fold, they would be compelled to increase their defense budget. And that would be detrimental to their interests. Why has Germany and Japan become very important or as a major industrial player post Second World War? It's because they did not try to spend more on defense. They concentrated on their economies. And that's how we have been here. We have reached, they have reached there, and we have reached here. India, in that case, would be the, a dominant player, but a neutral player, a non-aligned player, carrying on with whatever the present government might say that we are following with the multi-alignment. That it's not multi-alignment, mind you. It's non-alignment with a different avatar. Non-alignment which was also multi-alignment. How do you interpret it becomes very difficult, right? And who's the interpreter is also becomes very difficult. How much time do I have, sir? I'll conclude in another 5 minutes. What we are now looking forward towards the world would be a world in which the multiple players would become active. The players which had dominated these 30 years, especially the European states, would take a back seat, and as I said, Asia would emerge as an economy, and India would have an important role to play. Here I conclude, and I notice Madam Supriya Sule amongst us. Warm welcome to you, ma'am. And I would now ask the organizers to take over. Thank you.